Hello, and welcome to another episode of Conscious Curiosity. I'm your host, Modius Silva, and we're in for a treat today with this episode. It is not about Barbara Streisand, but it is about memory and the way we were. So I'm going to introduce you in a moment to our guest today, Dr. David Gottlieb from Chicago, Illinois, who is an expert in looking at narratives, in particular narratives from the Bible, and pulling stories, pulling ideas from those narratives to understand how memory constructs who we are. In addition to looking at the whole construct of memory and how it impacts who we are in this world, we'll also talk in this episode about how memory might, or remembering, might help heal trauma. And then we'll flip over and look at how accurate memory is, the whole idea of truth versus fiction in terms of our memory. And we'll look at we'll look at fake news, customizable memory, and this 1950 movie from Japan called Rashomon, and the effect that people talk about today. It's called the Rashomon effect, where people swear up and down that they remember something that actually never happened. And we'll talk about that and the embodied experience as a form of memory around truth and falsehood. So all of that is embedded and woven through the discussion in this episode that I have right now with David Gottlieb. So please sit back, enjoy. Okay, welcome, David. Thank you,
Modia.
Thank you so much for joining us on Conscious Curiosity.
Delighted to be here.
Great. And you are, I see some sunshine rolling in through your window. You're in Chicago, right?
I'm in Chicago, where what we call first spring, or fool's spring, is about to come to an end. But it's been beautiful. The ice in the harbor and on the lake has melted, and hope is in the air.
Hope is in here. That's great. So we have the same here. I think we have similar weather.
We pretty much have the same weather, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in Toronto, and I went for a run yesterday. It was 14 degrees Celsius, whatever that means in American.
That's in the 50s, I think.
Yeah.
Fahrenheit, yeah, which is what we have here.
Yeah, cool.
Delightful.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a lot about memory and other stuff, hopefully.
Yes.
And my interest, just to let you know, well, I have lots of interests, so I'm sure anything you're going to tell us is going to be great. But my interest is going to be, as a psychotherapist, how does memory play into who I think I am in this world? And how does memory support me? And how does it hold me back from being like the best I could be? And stuff like that.
Well, these are really, really interesting questions that go to the heart of how everyone now determines who they are, how everyone shapes their own stories. And after all, we are shapers and tellers of stories, and how everyone decides what groups, if any, they fit into. So you're asking really good questions. And just one of the interesting things to point out about memory right away is that it's hard for us even to agree what we talk about when we talk about memory, but there are a couple of fundamental assumptions that we should be aware of. One is, when we talk about memory in the West, in the postmodern West, mainly what we're talking about is our inner recording of our own experiences, impressions, thoughts, ideas, relationships. We tend to be talking about what happened and our recollection of what happened. But throughout history, memory has meant many different things, and that's only one of the things it meant. And that's a relatively recent iteration of what it meant. In other words, memory in ancient religious traditions to which we're heir, memory really meant a faithfulness to what had been commanded, a regular faithfulness and constant repetition of what had been commanded. And that was a collective obligation. But now we think of memory much more as a singular and individual and somewhat customizable template for who we are.
Oh, so that's interesting. So, right. So we're diving into definition to start with. And
Yeah.
so you're talking about how memory or the definition of memory has changed over time.
Yes.
But you also said the way we think about it in the West. Are
Yes.
you saying this memory is different, like in the East?
Well, there are certain things I'm more qualified to talk about than others. As someone with a PhD in the history of Judaism, I'm more qualified to talk about the ancient Near East, and really there in the ancient traditions of and that preceded the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Memory meant something a little different. Really, in Judaism, for example, memory was typically speaking, it began in the pre-rabbinic era as the recognition of an obligation to be faithful to a set of commandments and to commemorate certain events in specific ritualized ways. The thing that I did most of my research on, as you know, was the story of the binding of Isaac in the biblical book of Genesis, a story that also appears in the Quran and that also has great significance to Christianity because it's seen as a prefiguration of the crucifixion of Jesus. In the Jewish tradition, that story sets in motion a whole cult of ritualized sacrifice as a memorialization of the event when Abraham is said to have almost sacrificed his son at God's command and then stopped at God's command at the last minute. And that as a result of that, God rewards Abraham and his descendants with a firmly covenanted relationship that will last throughout the generations. That kicks off something called Zechut Avot, the merit of the fathers, which means that everybody that comes after derives merit from that act. But part of the contractual obligation of continuing to deserve merit is commemorating that act. And that act was commemorated first in ritual sacrifice at the temple. And after the temple was destroyed for the second time in the year 70 of the Common Era, that the commemoration of that act moved into prayer and into ritualized regular prayer, which in the Jewish tradition is to happen 3 times a day. A similar story is told in Islam, where there became an argument, a theological argument about whether it was Isaac or Ishmael who'd been sacrificed. And it was eventually determined in Islamic tradition, although the Quran doesn't name who it was, that it was Ishmael that was sacrificed. So these things show how memory can branch and how dependent it is on interpretation. And we don't think of it that way today.
So that's amazing. That was fast.
Sorry, that was a lot.
No, it was a lot to race through essentially 4,000 years of history.
That's what I do, Moja. That's what I do.
But I heard everything, but I actually got stopped at when you said that was the test or that was the command for Abraham, the father, to take his son, Isaac, or Ishmael in the case of the Quran, up onto a mountaintop to sacrifice him.
Yes.
And I remember that was actually his 10th test.
That's right.
Right? 10th and final test.
That's right.
So I wonder, where do you think his head was in this whole thing?
This is a great question. And what you point out is one of the interesting interpretive stances we take with respect to this story, at least in the Jewish tradition. And that is, we're really concerned about what's going on in Abraham's head. Abraham is given a command that's impossible. He either disobeys God or he murders his own son. The archetypal no-win situation.
Right. Without telling his wife what he's doing.
Without telling his wife, correct.
Yeah.
With whom Isaac appears to have a very close relationship. So, in the early psychiatric tradition, certainly, for example, Freud was very interested in the story of Moses, was somewhat interested in the story of Abraham. Everybody's interested in where Abraham's head is at. And that's the question you asked me. My the thing that drove my research was wondering where Isaac's head was at, because I think all of us have aspire in some way in our heart of hearts to be Abraham, but all of us, regardless of what our lives are like, are really Isaac. That is, we're thrown into the world, um, uh, born into circumstances we cannot control, have relationships with people, our parents typically, who have ultimate power over us and who can subject us to all sorts of things as a result of our innocence. And we have to find a way to survive and make meaning out of those events without letting them crush our spirit. There's lots of commentary about where Abraham's head was, lots of very interesting commentary. For example, some commentators say that he was clearly walking a genius line between obeying God and delaying, hoping to find a way out. He was obeying and rebelling at the same time, which is a brilliant way to see an otherwise indefensible act.
Right.
Isaac, on the other hand, is trusting and open and almost gets slaughtered.
Right. And so for me, that tells me there's a lot to learn about holding. If I have Abraham in me, then I have to hold these polarities that are seemingly cannot relate to each other. Right. And so which I have in my life. I often have polarities of I want to do something, I don't want to do something. And then I sit at the impasse of not knowing what's going to come next, not knowing if my needle is going to slide one way or the other.
Yes.
And can I just be with that, that apparent, what's the word? I don't know, like contradictory state of being.
That contradiction. And you rely, whether you realize it or not, on your memory to help you make that determination. Your memory is always there, composed of comprising different sense impressions, different relationships that tell you how to act in that moment. And evolutionarily speaking, you've been designed to constantly revise a narrative as you go through a day, as you build relationships, as you solve problems. And it is your memory that's called upon to do that. But your memory is not merely a recording device. It's a bank of impressions. It's a myth-making operation. And anatomically speaking, it involves several different regions of the brain, which means it's not a simple operation. It's a very complex, multi-layered operation. And in your case, I would say in the case of most men, we are born as Isaac and turn into Abraham, whether we want to or not. And the story of the binding of Isaac excludes women. And so there's always a burning question of how this story excludes the feminine aspect from the zealous desire to obey the will of God. Part of the reason the interpreters think Abraham doesn't say anything to Sarah, his wife, Isaac's mother, is because she'll be so distraught that then he won't be able to go through with God's command. This says a lot about how we divide our memory, about how men are believed to and supposed to act in a certain way and how women aren't. And in some ways, classically, how women have been cut out of how social memory or collective memory is constructed.
Although I wonder if you took a little bit of poetic license, if Isaac is that sort of open, naive character who's accepting and loving, and Abraham has that conflictual duality and those polarities, if somewhere in that story, forgetting the fact that they were all male, there actually is the feminine and the masculine embedded into the whole story.
Yes. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because there is a Kabbalistic tradition in the Jewish mystical tradition. There's speculation. There's speculation that there was something different about Isaac. The text is not specific as to what it was. But of course, you can imagine that he might have been different because his parents were both 99 pushing 100 when he was born. So, just from a genetic standpoint, that could result in some interesting things. Isaac is is speculated in the mystical tradition to have the soul of a woman. And so,
Aha.
one possibility in the story of the binding of Isaac is that Abraham is brought to the brink of killing the feminine that resides in the masculine,
Hmm.
but then stopped from doing it.
Can you just say that again? That's like,
Is it blowing your circuits?
yeah, I think it blew my circuits.
So there's a Kabbalistic, a Jewish mystical tradition that says that Isaac is actually has the soul of a woman, the
Mhm.
body of a man, the soul of a woman. The Kabbalistic tradition speculates this. And what that means from a psychological perspective is that there's a constant temptation to kill the feminine aspect of our masculine side.
Ah.
That especially, that we're all yin and yang, right? We all have masculine and feminine aspects. That what the story of the binding of Isaac is on a psychological level is the masculine's constant temptation to kill the feminine.
Wow, to overpower to the point of killing it,
That's right. That's right.
to control
And
and dominate.
and that's a trauma, right? That's a trauma
Mhm.
that gets inherited by the entire people, that gets commemorated uh, like in Jewish daily prayer. The story of the binding of Isaac is read every single day. This is a fundamental trauma that we revisit, reenact, or remember on regular bases. That's because one of the ways to heal trauma is to remember it and to engage in what is one scholar, Catherine Pickstock, calls non-identical repetition. That is to say, we in religious traditions repeat things over and over again, never quite exactly the same, right? We go through a liturgical calendar. All all nations, all countries, all religions, all faiths go through a calendar and commemorate things. They're never commemorated exactly the same way twice, but the repetition helps build it into the DNA of the remembering culture. And if it's a trauma, it helps heal it. Repeating it, revisiting it, that's how you heal from it. It's not avoidance, it's the opposite.
So it's really interesting that you say that, because I want to present another path, a different path.
Yeah.
Is one of the things I practice with my clients is something called somatic experiencing,
Uh-huh.
which is a trauma therapy that was created by Peter Levine out of California. And the thesis that he would put forward is that actually diving back into the trauma and revisiting it actually reinforces it as opposed to heals it. And so
Interesting.
he has different approaches of sort of going to the edge of the story but not going into it. So if you think of like a tornado or some sort of vortex,
Yeah.
that you touch into the edge and pull back out to a safe positive space to kind of rebuild yourself, rewire your neurons, your neural
Right.
pathways,
Right.
and then you can go back to the edge again, but you never would dive back into it.
Well, so there are two responses to that. One is, think of any religious commemoration of a traumatic event.
Mm-hmm.
For example, uh, the taking of the Eucharist, taking communion. Okay. No one's actually dividing up someone's body to share, and yet you are told when you take communion in the Christian tradition that you are eating the body of Christ and drinking with the wine the
Mm-hmm.
blood of Christ. So you're going to the edge of the tradition. Similarly, in Judaism, uh, you are reenacting or remembering an event, but you're not throwing someone down on an altar
Right.
and brandishing a knife over their head. These traditions may be a kind of somatic experiencing, but they
Yeah.
may be traumatic for some nonetheless.
Right. And then the question is, do you pull back? So I might have a client who says, I cannot go back to this person and confront them because they served a trauma for me earlier on in my
Mm-hmm,
life or whatever.
mm-hmm.
And over time I might say, can you imagine doing it in your head as opposed to doing it in reality? And so that's like, can I move to the edge of that trauma
Yes,
vortex?
yes,
And you're right, even that might be too triggering for someone.
right.
And so
So,
so then
yeah,
there's other approaches, but you're constantly pulling back until you can find the edge that the person can actually approach.
So in doing that, you are literally remembering the event, right? If you
Hmm.
put a hyphen in that word, you're not only bringing it back into your consciousness, in some fundamental way, you're altering it.
So in my reading of of the neuroscience of memory, I think that's what the latest thinking is they call it reconsolidation.
So tell me about what is reconsolidation
Well, I
exactly?
think consolidation is the collection of experiences into sort of a memory bank.
Uh-huh.
And then when you go revisit that memory, it changes every single time. And then that has to be that new information or that little change that happens has to be
Uh-huh.
consolidated again into your memory bank. And that's reconsolidation.
That's so interesting.
And the only, and if you think of like wheat in a husk, the data, the explicit memory of the data, like this happened, the car was red, I was standing on a street, all these things would be the explicit memory that serves as the wheat. And
Right.
then the husk around it is the emotional memory, which in some ways the implicit memory is what was my emotional response to the event that I'm going to put into my memory.
So,
And sorry, can I
yeah,
just
yeah,
to
yeah.
finish that the thinking is that the explicit memory, the data of what actually happened, changes over time and constantly gets reconsolidated, but the emotional response doesn't. It stays the same.
So I think we are we're conducting, as you know, we're conducting this podcast in English,
Yeah.
and I think English is a little bit linguistically impoverished when it comes to the idea of memory. Many other languages, um, I'll give you just two examples: German and Hebrew have more than one word for memory. In the Hebrew Bible, there's Zachor, the trilateral root uh, uh, given in its noun form, which means memory, but there's also poked, which is to revisit, and the word poked has the shading of intimacy. For instance, what a couple of places in the Bible, God remembers a woman and she becomes pregnant.
Mm.
So this has an aspect of facilitating or cultivating fertile intimacy. To zachor, to remember something, is to be, again, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, to sort of recall to mind, but also to faithfully commemorate something. In German, there are two different words, Erinnerung and Gedächtnis. Erinnerung is sort of the storage of past events and memories, but Gedächtnis is more, I want to say, impressionistic. And there's even a third word, Speicher, which means storage, essentially. It's like the hard drive. But the German language distinguishes between the data and the impressions. In English, we got one word, remember, memory.
Right.
And 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 that is a problem because these operations are actually quite different. And I think I have to say, even though we're not exactly talking about this right now, all of this is complicated by the fact that we have so much data coming at us right now, and that we are so reliant on data that memory is undergoing a radical change in our lifetimes.
Wow. A radical change in our minds as well, in our brains?
I
Or you
certainly
mean
think
at
we're
a social level?
I do mean at a social level, but I think that social changes tend to rewire us, and I think this change is already showing signs of rewiring us, because we are sort of self-sorting into communities that have certain preferences for certain kinds and sources of data, and those communities tend to shape what sort of perspective we have on events and ideas going forward. So it changes our memories as we go. And I think that we are, in terms of our genetic and physiological structure, right now, our physiognomy is way behind the amount of data that we're able to take in. It's the proverbial fire hose aimed at a teacup. And what this is doing to memory is it's eroding it significantly, especially in its collective form. And I think this is further exacerbated by the pandemic year that we've been through. We're recording this conversation on the 1-year anniversary, at least in the United States, of when everything started to shut down. And the result of that has been a kind of social isolation, which has scrambled people's minds, alienated people from their own emotions, and is going to have, I predict, a profound effect on how people remember not only this event, but remember going forward. Isolation will do that to you. And so, but we're going to have a ton of data through which to recall this event. And that didn't used to be the case. As recently as 50 years ago, we had very few sources of data. We all had access to those same sources of data. And going back 100 years prior to that, you had very little literacy. And 200 years prior to that, you had very few books. And 1,000 years prior to that, you had a few people who memorized everything, and people depended on those people. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but you can see, if you trace that backwards, how difficult it is for our memory apparatus to accommodate all the data we take in and shape memories out of all that data.
I'm taking all that in again, just what you said, allowing it maybe to sink into my memory. But
I mean, the short version of what I'm saying is, right now, you and I and the world we live in, our evolutionary our physical apparatus is way behind what's happening, and we're living through it. Our kids are going to remember much differently and much different things than we do.
So this is what I'm thinking, that we're not talking, when we're talking about memory, we aren't talking about truth. We're talking about an organic, ever-changing, dynamic reality or perception of the world as we see it. And
that's a very important distinction. And I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And then you're talking about social memory, or
Right.
communities of memory,
right,
and isolation. And I think that's where I was just thinking, what does that mean? I'm isolated, and yet I'm isolated because of the pandemic. And yet, if I look out into the news, whichever news I pick, it looks to me like there are collections of communities that are forming around beliefs of memory.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Whether it's CNN or Fox or in the US, right? Like this whole thing of fake news. And how do I, as an individual sitting in my pandemic isolation, fit into one of these communities?
So you've raised a couple of really interesting questions. One is, how do I fit in? Do I have to self-select into one of these myth-making communities, essentially, right? And the other is, how is customizable memory different from fake news? Is memory creating fake news? Or is memory gonna be shaped by all the fake news, by QAnon and Stop the Steal and masks are for sissies, that kind of thing? What is our memory doing exactly? And why is it under crisis? So the phenomenon of fake news is a kind of metastasizing version of myth-making memory. Myth-making is not telling a lie or spinning a fable. It is trying to make meaning out of something, to detect a pattern in which no pattern can currently be detected. And so the phenomenon of the perspective that creates the idea called fake news is a perspective that feels its own ways of making meaning are under threat. So it's going to propose an alternate way of making meaning and call it the traditional, the true, the correct way of making meaning. And there are always contests between whose memory, what record is going to be the official one, And we're all subject to that, whether we want to be or not. As individuals, we struggle to remember certain things, but we're also members of communities of memory, as you said. And that means we have certain people who believe as we do, who think as we do, and who share a common fund of ideas and events that help tell us who we are. And we're always asking, who am I? Who am I today?
So it seems like we're kind of caught at both ends. If I take all that data and turn it into myth and create a meaning out of that myth,
Mm-hmm.
then I stand the chance of ossifying that, of becoming rigid with it, and pushing myself to one extreme. And I'm going to join a community that supports that extreme. And the other is, you said there's so much data coming at us that it's difficult to make sense of it, to turn it into myth and turn it into meaning. And without any structure and any meaning, I'm at the other polarity and I'm stuck as well.
Absolutely. So one of the important points that you brought up is a phenomenon that we see in religion after the Enlightenment takes place in the late 18th and into the 19th century. Here you get the idea that knowledge is the province of a few and is derived from holy books and communities of tradition, comes under severe attack in the Enlightenment by the growing belief that empirical knowledge, scientific data, and objective truth are knowable, and that those are the things, along with a rational epistemology, a rational viewpoint, that should guide life going forward. And religion has two reactions to this. It's true across religions in the creation of denominations. One reaction is to bar the door, to seal the gates of the spiritual city, and to say the truth that existed up until this moment is the truth. And modernity and rationality and enlightenment empiricism are threats to that truth. It's out. Another more modulated reaction in more reformed traditions is to say religion, if it's inflexible, can no longer claim to be a guide to truth. It is choosing control over truth, and it is barring the human role in bringing about salvation or redemption or the Messiah or human perfection or whatever you'd like to call it. So, on the one hand, you have our story as it is today is always going to be our story. And on the other hand, you have we must meet the moment, right? And this is a constant struggle between two different outlooks on the world, one of which says our rules guide us and must not change, and one that says we are partners with the divine, if the religion promotes that idea, or we are inheritors of truth from moment to moment, and we must constantly adjust our course so that we can modify our own response to what arises in the moment. So rigidity versus elasticity are two classic religious responses to the challenges of modernity. And that happens on the individual level too, right? If you suffer a trauma, you might say, I am going to live as I lived before this happened and pretend it never happened.
Right.
Or you may
Right.
say, I must confront this so that I can surmount it and become essentially a new person.
Right. So I get that. And I'm actually overlaying it back onto the way I practice psychotherapy, which might suggest that many therapists would say, I want to do the latter. I want some flexibility and I don't want to be so rigid. And my approach with a client would be, which one serves you?
Yeah.
Where'd
Yeah.
you get your support from that helps you be the full you? And some people might get it from that rigidity, that no, these are the commands and that's how I want to live my life, because that's where support comes from. And some people might say, I have to hold that frame much more loosely because that's how I get support.
I think you're making a very important point, and I should clarify. It makes me want to clarify what I said. Was that I don't mean to make implicit in my statement that religious orthodoxy is wrong. I don't I don't think there is such a thing as wrong insofar as it does not seek an inordinate amount of control over people who don't agree with such a view or feel like they want to be compelled to live by it. It has its virtues, and it is responsible for preserving traditions that otherwise would have been completely eroded by modernity. And in any human being, in any family group, and in any society, there is an ecosystem, right?
Mhm.
And there's a spectrum of what works for people. And you are very correct, I think, to say, and I know you too well for you to be my therapist, otherwise I'd ask you on the spot. I think you're very correct to point out that different modalities work for different people. And that is why post-modernity, we have a whole spectrum of religious denominations within most religious traditions and different ways of expressing faithfulness to that tradition. It's the same thing the individual must do. How can I meet this moment? How can I address this challenge? How can I survive this trauma?
Mhm.
Must draw from both traditional responses and innovations. I think that's always true of anybody. The mixture is the difference.
Yeah, I think so. And when you talk about a complex like entity organization, let's say a family, I fully agree with that. That there's a response at a family level. There's a response at each individual member's level, and
Mhm.
so I think about a memory recall that I had with a sibling of mine that is completely different. A childhood memory recall that they remember it one way and I remember it a different way, and
This is
they
what
are
we call the Rashomon effect, right?
right. So the Rashomon effect, yeah. So the Rashomon is a movie, right? That was a 1950 movie from Japan,
Right.
where, if I remember, four people witnessed a murder. I think there was like a samurai, the wife, a woodcutter, and someone else,
Yes. Right.
right? And they all swear up and down that their memory of that murder was the correct one. And one
Exactly.
of them, I think in the movie, one of them confesses to the murder, and they didn't actually do the murder, but they believe that they did.
Right. So what does this tell us about memory? That it's inextricably bound up with individual perspective, and that as an arbiter of objective truth, its usefulness is limited. We
Mm,
have to confront that idea. But that doesn't mean that that the perspectives that contain factual error have no legitimacy, right? They're born of the perspectives, the problems, the idiosyncrasies, and the perceptual apparatus of the people who are having the memory. What is one to do, right? This is a problem in courts all the time with two people who swear that they saw what they saw and the two things are incompatible.
right, right.
So what do you do when someone in therapy says, I insist that this happened this way, and someone else around this event, this incident, perhaps a trauma, remembers it a different way? What does one do?
Well, I would step back from the content because, as you say, we'll never be able to, unless someone took a video at the moment, we'd never actually be able to figure out what the truth was in terms of the content.
Mhm.
So I step back from the content and I'm more interested in the impact on the person of their memory of it.
Okay. Okay.
And which for me as a somatic practitioner usually means I want to drop down into the body.
Ah,
And and so you tell me that this happened. What is your embodied response in telling me that now? And then can we start to approach the story from an embodied place instead of from a memory place, because I already know my memory is locked in and I'm so convinced it's correct.
well, this is an interesting thing you said, and I think it's worth investigating a little further because I think also in the West, we assume that memory's in the head, but memory can be embodied too, right? And that's exactly what you're identifying when you have in somatic experiencing, you have people drop down into
Right.
the body. And that's why so many religious traditions and others, uh, but religious traditions embody rituals. Our problem in the West is that we're very cerebrally oriented, very head centered.
Hmm.
And the data that we get now, so much of it, especially when we're sensorially deprived in this year of pandemic, so much of the data we're getting is by reading. It comes in through our eyes and goes to our brain. It's not embodied experience. But
Right.
embodied experience is a form of memory, right?
Oh yeah. There's a very popular book by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a guru in trauma therapy, called "The Body Keeps the Score,"
Hmm.
and it's very much along those lines that um, that even as memory in our brain changes, the memory in the body at some level in the nervous systems maintains it. And
So this is a very difficult example, and I hope it's not going to trouble your listeners. But for example, if someone insists that they were abused in some way and the body holds the memory of that abuse,
mhm,
what is more important? Determining objectively whether the abuse happened as that person said it happened, or dealing with the trauma that's been inflicted on the body? Right? From a therapist's perspective, you really have to deal with what's in the body, right?
correct,
And like you said,
correct,
you may never be able to determine objectively
right,
exactly what happened. The importance is the body received a blow of some kind,
right. And
and the physical apparatus holds that.
it may hold it. So
Okay.
if, yes, so the physical apparatus will hold it if it was a traumatic event. If there was a level of overwhelm,
Hmm.
then the body will go into a freeze, or like it'll go into a freeze or a collapse mode.
Okay. Okay.
And but there might be an abusive event that your body is able to handle, and kind
Hmm.
of in an animalistic way, you you shoulder that, and then it moves through you and it passes through, and there is no trauma. There's no residual trauma. But
Interesting.
yes, if the body holds it because it was overwhelmed in that moment of trauma, of abuse, then it's going to hold it, and it's going to become a pattern.
And as the therapist, that's what you have to deal with, not the detective work of let's find out what actually happened here, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. And very much. So because I blend different therapy modalities, I might go back to the context or the content and actually see what happened, or at least what the client thinks happened.
Hmm.
But very often in pure somatic experiencing, there's very little, if any, discussion about content. It's really just about what is your body doing now?
Hmm.
And can you
Hmm.
describe it at what we'd call a phenomenological level?
Yeah.
In other words, can I just describe tension? Can I describe heaviness? Can I describe tingling? Like sensory
Yeah.
experiences,
Yeah.
and just
And of
watch it
course,
move and watch it move.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
when it's stuck, then there are just techniques to help explore whether there's space to allow it to ultimately move.
I have another question for you. I this is a conversation, not an interview. I hope you don't mind me turning the tables on you. But um, excuse me. I'm presuming you have clients from different cultural backgrounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
the same. So part of the interesting thing about collective memory, about cultural social memory, is that is that even an elemental event that delivers some kind of blow to our physical apparatus is held in some sort of cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
We're not blank slates. And where we come from, not only the peculiar dynamics particular to our home lives, but the cultural context that those home lives are situated in, shapes how we remember that, how we record that differently, right? So how do
Yeah.
you accommodate that? Because the idea in cultural memory is that we're all given contexts, frames for our memory, and that shapes what we remember and how we remember it. So, in a client focused perspective, how does that come into play?
I think it depends on whether it has whether staying within that framework, that cultural framework, creates a maladaptive behavior or a
Huh.
maladaptive way of thinking.
Okay.
going back to what I said before, it could be very supportive. So,
Yes.
let's say someone is in a war-torn country and has
Hmm.
faced horrible events. It might be supportive for them to stay there. Like I read the news and I think, why, unless it's for economic reasons or, other ways that they have no mobility to move out of that place, why would they stay in a town or village or city that's being bombed constantly?
Mm.
There may be at some level a support that they're getting from the people in the environment around them that
Yeah.
allows them to stay there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I want to be careful not to judge their experience
Right.
or judge the like the geopolitical experience of that
Uh-huh.
community and
Hmm.
say they'd be crazy to stay in that village, because it
Right.
may actually be the most supportive thing that they can do to stay there.
Right. So, and another example might be uh, a woman who's an immigrant from a country in which, women stay in the home, are responsible for domestic life, in some ways are subservient to men. Um, Suffers a certain trauma at the hands of a man who has power over her, and yet she's in Toronto, and perhaps she's getting therapy from you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be a whole set of memories in which her life story is embedded that you may only have partial access to.
Right.
And
And
she's in, yeah, go ahead.
and sorry, and she may only have partial access to it as well.
Exactly right.
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 Right. So then the two of you have to do the job of stitching together a commonly agreed upon framework for the memories that she has
Right.
as a way to
And
move forward.
the only way to move forward would be in a safe environment. So
Absolutely.
so let's say it is this person who, and let's say they're facing domestic abuse,
Hmm.
then it's not okay for me as a therapist to say, oh, well, how do you feel about being abused and attacked constantly by, the person you're with?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I have a responsibility to ensure a level of safety,
Yes.
which
Right.
might be staying in the place they are. It might be getting them out into a safer place. And then the work of healing, of sharing common memory, or sharing, sorry, uncommon memory,
Yeah.
right? And stitching
Yeah.
it together, as you say, can only begin when they can operate within sort of a window of tolerance, of emotional
Yes.
tolerance.
Right. But it seems like the important thing about memory to the work that you do as a therapist is um, is in how to deal with the fact that we are, um, Homo narrativus, the storytelling ape, and that we are
Mhm.
constantly that we have evolved to tell ourselves stories as a way to plan our way forward into opportunity and out of crisis. And because we tell stories, our memory is always trailing right behind us. It's almost like a jet trail, right?
Mm.
The part that's closest to us is still very fluid and expanding. The part that's further back behind us has frozen in the atmosphere and is less likely to change. But it's those memories that are close up that we have the opportunity to revisit most immediately. But we're embedded in traditions, usually in societies, even in families that have their own collective memories. And that keeps the part of the jet trail that's way behind you still fluid. It keeps what is ancient still alive. And there's something that modernity has disprivileged about that, but that is very powerful. And I think we're in a large part in the postmodern West, we're missing that now. And we are trying to remake communities of memory out of whole cloth.
Out of, sorry,
Whole cloth.
whole cloth.
Yeah.
But what you're saying, if I understand you, is that that trail behind the plane, which is the history of or the past, and saying it's still alive, tells us that we have to keep it alive through storytelling, that we have to bring the past into the present.
Absolutely. And it's not the history I'm talking about, it's the memory.
Or the
The two
mem
things are very different,
Okay.
the other reason that collective memory has come under attack is because now we have everything is documented, everything is archived, right?
Mm.
There's record high levels of literacy. And if we don't know, we can Google it. We can find out what dominant sources and forces say literally happened. So we're less reliant on memory. But we still need our memories. Our memories are being put in a position where they're not as important, or they're being treated as not as important, but they're super duper important. So yes, the jet trail is memory. And what we do collectively keeps that jet trail fluid present longer than if we didn't pay attention to it. Then it would freeze and fall apart.
Right. And that jet trail has lots of elements to it as well. It has the
Absolutely.
facts, it has the emotions, it has the, and so going back to when we talked about a family situation of me remembering a childhood event completely differently than my sibling.
Yeah, yeah.
If we only go to one piece of that jet trail and say, let's try and figure out who was right, like we'll never do it. But where we can meet, where I can meet with my sibling, is at least at the emotional memory level. It's like you can't deny my emotion. I have this experience, this memory emotional experience.
Yes.
And
Right.
I'd love to hear about yours. And that allows us to come and sip a cup of tea together.
You know, it puts me in mind of a similar story that I have, that my brother and I and our parents lived in Mexico for a year. I was 12 and my brother was 15.
Mm-hmm.
And we have completely different memory patterns for that whole year of experience. It could be because he's him and I'm me. It could be that he was a little older and more mature than me, but he has very detailed memories of many of the experiences we had. And my memories are very impressionistic. So he'll say, do you remember that time that we were in town in northern Mexico and we saw a minor league baseball game, and I had a hamburger that night for dinner and was terribly sick? And I will say, no, I just remember the sound of you retching in our hotel room that night. You know, his memory is very detailed. I have this one auditory memory. So those different perspectives within a family are super important, as long as you can agree that both perspectives are really valuable, and as long as there's no lying going on.
Right. And I think to do that, we haven't talked about this, but it seems like everything we're talking about with memory and in a family situation requires a lot of humility.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'm going to constantly insist that my memory is correct and yours is incorrect.
That is a beautiful observation. Because we think of memory as a recording of events, and because we think of our memory as accurate because it's ours, it can lead to a lack of humility. Humility around memory, especially when trying to heal certain events or relationships, is critically important, because you have to bestow legitimacy on someone else's memory before you question its veracity.
Right. Nice. Yeah. It came up for me because I had a lot of trouble in the high school I went to in England. And the only person that I remember that I could share these stories with was a cousin who was several years older than me. So when I was in my first year high school, grade 7 in England, she would have been grade 11 or 12. So 5 years apart. And in the summer of 2019, I went back to England and I saw her. And I thought we could commiserate about this experience at school. And I've lived with that my whole life, like since childhood. And so I talked to her about it, and she was like, that's not the high school I went to.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, no, it was, because I have a vivid memory of standing in the auditorium with you and this happening. And she's like, I went to this high school, not the one you went to.
So not only did she have no memory of the event, she wasn't even there.
Correct. So it wasn't like your brother and you, where all you remember is the retching, and he has a much more elongated story. Right. Like my memory was actually completely wrong, according to the fact. It's not. Sorry.
Have you had a mental evaluation recently? Are you sure you're okay?
I've had a mental evaluation and I'm sure I'm not okay.
Okay, okay. Was it another cousin? Have you gotten to the
No,
bottom of why you have this memory?
no, no, not
It's
at all.
so interesting.
So what I did was I stepped back and I thought, oh, this is the place for humility. This is the place
Mhm.
for me to let go of that story and recognize that for whatever reason my brain has had constructed it and then held on to it for decades for support, and now it's appropriate to let it go
So
because
what you just said is your memory held onto it for support. So maybe that memory needed to be created.
Mhm. I think it did. I think
Okay.
it did to accommodate, like to help me navigate the trauma of the experience at school.
Right.
Like
Right.
that there was at least one supportive person at the school to be with me in that trauma,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And now I don't need that person because because they weren't there in the first place.
So she's released you from that trauma. That was
Yeah,
very good of her. I
yeah.
hope it wasn't too traumatic to realize that you had created a false memory.
Uh-huh. Mm,
We're talking mostly about individual memory. And when I talk about social or collective memory, um, it's sort of thin ice. It's been a fascination. It was a fascination, particularly in the scholarly world at the end of the 20th century. And that is partly because lots of societies, especially in Europe, were trying to come to grips with the memories of the trauma of World War II and
mm,
the Holocaust around the 50th anniversary of those events. And as a result of that, especially in Germany, there was a huge push to understand how memory could coalesce around German responsibility for the Holocaust, pushed by a couple of scholars, in particular, a German Egyptologist named Jan Assmann. And Assmann said that societies remember, but other scholars have said, Amos Funkenstein, who was a historian, said societies don't remember in the same way that societies don't dance. It's the individuals that dance, and they're members of societies. So the struggle to realize what memory means in collective contexts is still going on 30 years after the idea of collective memory really gained currency in the scholastic world. Any individual now has to ask themselves, what community am I a part of? And what does that community ask me to remember
right.
as being a part of that community? And then how do those memories shape how I remember as an individual? And the third thing is memory just a recording device or is it also a myth making device? And what's my personal admixture of those two?
Right. And can I add a fourth one
Hmm.
in terms of social memory or
Yeah.
communal, which is which comes from field theory, from
Hmm.
physics, that every element in a system impacts every other element in the system.
I love that.
And so when I'm in community, what not just what does my community want from me in terms of memory, but how does me being in community modify or inform my memory as well?
Right. Right. You know, that reminds me of another um, physical phenomenon, which I'm, soundly unqualified to uh, recapitulate. And that is what Einstein called facetiously, but that was later proved to actually exist, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. Spooky action at a distance, very roughly put, is the is the phenomenon that two paired particles, despite their distance from one another, and the distances could be almost unimaginably vast, when one particle is affected by something, the other particle is too.
Is
They could
this
be,
is this
yes, go ahead.
scientific? Is there scientific proof for that?
Yes, there is increasing scientific proof for this. There have been studies that have measured this with increasing sophistication, and papers have been published just since the second half of last year that have delivered what I think is widely considered to be more and more definitive confirmation of this phenomenon. If it's true,
Mhm.
What it means is that when we are in community, like you said, things that affect one of us without immediate uh, co- evidence of any contact of others can immediately affect them as well.
Mm.
It's a profound phenomenon, and to the extent that it's true, that suggests our actions have cosmic consequences, a very religious,
Mhm.
a very spiritual idea.
Right.
And the idea that our memories contain ideas and impressions of those events so that we
Mm.
are inextricably interwound and interwoven with all sorts of people for whom we bear intimate responsibility almost to the extent that we do for ourselves.
Wow. I find that uplifting. I find it scary that I
Yeah,
have that level of responsibility, but I also find
yes.
it very uplifting that it actually connects. I feel a greater connection,
I'm
especially.
glad that you do. Some people would feel oppressed by it.
Oh, really?
Don't you think some people would be like, I am not responsible for my annoying younger brother who's always asking me for money. I will not be responsible. You know, why are you asking me to take on responsibility for that? But on a, okay, so you don't have to lend your annoying younger brother money, but on a cosmic level, his need
Mhm.
affects you.
Right. Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I completely buy into that.
yeah.
Um, from my side of it, if someone wants to look into it, um, it's the readings of, or the writings of Kurt Lewin,
Hmm.
Lewin.
Hmm.
David, we could talk for ages on this. I could keep talking for ages on this stuff. This is,
Yes, it's endlessly fascinating.
yeah. But I do remember that we have to end at some point.
Yes, I suppose we do.
If it's okay with you, I like to end the podcasts by asking you 3 questions.
Very good.
And they're just like, however you want to answer them, rapid fire, take forever, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you good with
Yeah,
that?
I'm game. I think so.
Okay. So the first question, yeah, you can turn it down once I ask you the question. The first question is, what is your superpower?
Um, my superpower is looking into someone's eyes and understanding how they're feeling at that particular moment, not how they're holding themselves, not how they're acting or what they're saying. It's looking into their eyes and seeing what's going on behind them.
Awesome. That's a great superpower to have.
It's sometimes it's a little scary.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. So the second question then is, what are you reading right now?
So my habit is to be reading several different things at once, which is a little vexing. But I'm reading one book right now called The Wandering Jew by Mika Goodman, which is about how there must be a middle way in Israeli society between increasingly rigid secular views and increasingly rigid
Hmm.
religious views. And he makes several concrete proposals about that. I'm also reading Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind,
Uh-huh.
which is a classic um, um, uh, transcript of talks given by the Zen Buddhist priest who came from Japan and really in the 70s, late 60s and early 70s, um, made possible the spread of Zen Buddhist practice in the United States.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I ask that firstly because I'm interested, but also
Mhm.
sometimes our audience members say, I want to read something. I don't know what. And
Yeah.
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 Our third question is, I have this book here, and there is a different question on each page.
Oh my God, this is terrifying.
Is it? We can skip it and you can make up
No,
your
no,
own
no,
question.
no, no. I'm
Okay, so
ready.
I will flip and you tell me
Yeah.
when to stop.
Stop.
Okay. That is very funny.
The question is,
How do you want to be remembered?
oh, come on.
It is.
You
It is.
bent that page. You bent the corner of that page. How do I
No.
want to be remembered?
How do you want to be remembered?
Oh my gosh.
Well, you're the
Um,
memory expert. You
I'm the memory guy. Yes. So one of the difficulties in answering that question is by whom? How do I want to be remembered? By whom? By my kids. I would love to be remembered as loving, patient, and giving, as someone with whom they didn't have a complicated and vexed relationship. In a wider sphere, I'd like to be remembered as someone who refocused attention on the idea of how memory helps construct who we are and how creative a faculty
Hmm.
memory is.
Beautiful. Thank you for playing along.
Oh, what is my prize?
I don't remember.
Okay, good. Good answer. Okay.
Dr. David Gottlieb has been our guest, and it has been an absolute pleasure to talk about, to have David, you wind us down the road of memory, social memory, collective memory, individual memory, um, where memory is myth, where it helps with meaning making and all those good things. It's just been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Pleasure's been mine. Thank you, Modia.
Yeah, thank you.